Hey, welcome back to Laser Engraving 911. So on this episode, we're going to talk about laser engraving wood and laser cutting wood. I'm going to share my top 10 best tips and tricks that I use and have been using for the last 10 years here at my laser engraving business. So if that sounds like something you want to get into, then buckle up, get your pen and paper out, because we're about to get into it on Laser Engraving 911. All right, let's talk about number one. My first pro tip is to always, when you can, try to laser engrave against the grain of the wood that you're trying to do. So you never want to engrave your logo or text or photos with the grain of the wood, because you'll get more lines and the engraving won't be as smooth and even. When you engrave against the grain of the wood, you're essentially creating a crosshatch pattern, which creates a much higher fidelity engraving, looks way better than engraving with the grain of the wood. It's just that extra little level of detail that really adds a difference to all your engravings. So when you can avoid it, don't engrave in the same direction as the grain of the wood. All right, pro tip number two. Let's talk about your air assist, when to use it and when not to use it. So a lot of new systems nowadays have the air assist either built into the laser head, they have the air pumped right through the cone head, and it's always blasting right down onto whatever you're doing. And the theory is, or the reason for that is they are wanting to pump air through the nozzle head to keep debris from getting on the lens. However, this poses a problem when you're engraving. When you engrave with too much air flowing out your nozzle, you're going to get all kinds of splash, soot all over the engraving, especially if it's too high. What you want to do is, if you have the ability to control the airflow, first of all, I recommend not having any air assist on when you're just doing engraving at all. If you have a strong fume extractor or an extraction fan, you should be able to pull away any particulates away from the lens. But if you can't turn your air assist off and you do have an external air assist, see if you can drop that air pressure down to just barely anything coming out of that nozzle, only when you're engraving. Now, when you're laser cutting wood, you want to make sure that you're at least 25 to 30 PSI coming out of that nozzle head to make sure that you're getting a nice clean cut and you're stopping any flame ups. So remember, when you're engraving, try not to use any air assist at all or zero air assist. And when you're cutting, put it at the maximum recommendation for your machine, which is usually about 25-30 PSI. You'll find that your engravings come out way cleaner and your cuts will come out nice and clean as well when you're using the right air pressure. Here's my number three pro tip. It's about engraving photos. So getting good laser engraved photos on wood starts with a few things. It starts with the highest quality picture you can get of the photo that you're trying to engrave. And if you get a low quality photo, you're going to have to use something like Photoshop or another software to try to upscale it before you process it. Next, you're going to want to make sure you process the photo properly. There's a lot of good tutorials on processing photos for laser engraving, and it is a very unique process. There's some software like Imager that do it for you. There's other software like Lightburn, and there's plenty of tutorials on that. And I'll list a link in the description below of some of the tutorials that I think you should watch. So preparing the photo is first and foremost very important. Now, when you first start engraving photos, you might think that you'll just use the same setting that you use for engraving wood logos or text on wood. And what you might be trying to get is that deep relief, carved out photo engraving look. But in actuality, photos look a lot better when they're engraved with much less power. You don't need a lot of power to get a good photo engraving. So here's a couple of tips for you. Drop your power way down, just enough to where you're browning the wood and getting a nice dark engraving. Don't try to go too deep. I like to use 300 DPI or 400 DPI for my photos. And if you got a lot of time on your hands, you can bump it up to 600, but you'll have to change your power and speed settings when you're messing around with the DPI. The last thing I want to talk about with photos is make sure you're picking the right kind of wood to engrave the photo on. Baltic birch and ply, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is not really the best wood for doing photos. You want to use a nice quality wood like alder wood, cherry wood, mahogany wood, cedar. You can engrave beautiful photos on those woods because you get a nice dark contrast to the wood and it browns and chars really nicely with the laser. So keep those things in mind next time you're getting ready to make a photo so you can get the best results possible. All right, pro tip number 4. Let's talk about laser cutting wood and specifically fine detailed laser cutting of wood. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind when you're cutting a high detailed laser cut file with lots of little tiny corners and little sharp edges and really just a lot of detail is you need to pick the right thickness of wood for that. You're not going to be able to cut super thick wood with all that detail because what you're going to get is you're going to get blowouts, something we call in the industry, and that's because the laser is moving so slow to get through that thick wood that it's blowing out all the fine detail. So if you're going to be cutting things like wood laser cut dangle earrings or really high detailed ornaments, you definitely want to consider the thickness of your material and keep it around maybe 3 to 4 millimeters thick. But if you need the end product to be thicker, consider doing multiple layers of thinner wood and gluing them together to get that thicker effect while keeping all the detail of the laser cut. So don't think that because you have this awesome super detailed laser cut design that you're going to be cutting it out of any thickness of wood you want. It's just not going to work. Know the limitations of your laser when cutting high detailed laser cut files and make sure that you pick the right thickness of wood for the job. All right, moving on to pro tip number 5, picking the right kind of wood for your laser engraving or laser cutting jobs. So one of the most common woods that everyone likes to use for their laser crafting projects is Baltic birch. It's cheap, it's easy to find, plenty of suppliers sell it, comes in multiple thicknesses, and it's great for doing mass production of laser cut signs, Christmas ornaments, all kinds of projects like that. However, it is plywood in the end, which means that it is put together with multiple layers of wood and there's glue in between those layers, which can make it kind of difficult for the laser to cut at times, and also can be a problem when you're trying to do deep engravings. As you're engraving past each layer, you could reveal the ugly glue in the next layer, which doesn't really look that good in the end. Now, if you're just painting it in the end, it really doesn't matter. But something you want to consider is if you're looking to make higher end laser cut products, or engraved products, consider using real solid wood. I understand that using solid wood sheets is much more expensive than just buying a big old crate of plywood, and that's fine. Each wood is good for a different project. But if you're looking to get into making higher end laser cut projects, like laser cut fine jewelry, some really high end wood placard cards or signs, you want to consider getting some real solid sheet wood to do your projects with. Some of my favorite woods to use are alder, cherry, mahogany, and cedar. These woods cut beautifully, they engrave beautifully, and it really does allow me to command a higher price for the things that I make and sell because they're made from solid, real quality wood. There's so many different kinds of woods that you can laser engrave and cut. They each have their pluses and minuses depending on the project you're working on. I'll list a link to all my resources down in the description below of where I like to get both my Baltic birch ply and other types of ply for craft projects, and I'll list a link to where I get my solid sheets of wood like alder, cherry, mahogany, cedar for my higher end projects, so you can get the right wood for your next project. All right, pro tip number 6, keeping your wood flat when it's in storage in your shop. So have you ever noticed that you've got some plywood or other kind of wood laying around and you come back to it a month later and it's all warped and it's looking like a wavy, like a great wave from Japan or something like that? Well, that happens because the humidity, the moisture in the shop, the temperature of your shop, and it also happens because it's been out loose. So a couple ways you can avoid that I have found to be helpful over the years is you can keep all your sheet wood stacked up nice and neat and you can put some big, heavy 12 by 12 granite tiles on top of it to keep it all compressed. That has worked for me. The other thing you can do, which is a little bit more of a pain, but it works really well, is you can grab some like cellophane, one of those packing rolls from like Uline, and you can wrap up your sheet wood that you're not using really tight and compress it into a stack and then slide it into wherever it's being stored. Basically, you want to try to keep that wood compressed while it's in storage and nice and flat. So when you do go to pull it out for a project, you don't have to deal with warped wood or curved wood, because that is just a pain to deal with keeping it flat in the laser bed. Those are just a couple of ways that I've found that help me avoid that here in my shop. All right, let's give you my pro tip number 7, getting darker engravings on wood that doesn't want to engrave dark. Now, I do have another video on using borax with woods like Baltic birch and light maple and things like that, where you can get a nice dark engraving. And that's one technique, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. What I wanted to talk about was another couple of tricks that you can use to get a darker engraving on wood that just doesn't want to engrave dark. One of the number one tricks that you can do is to defocus your laser about 2 or 3 millimeters above the surface, whatever you're engraving. I like to start with the width of about 2 pennies. You can increase it, but keep in mind that the more you defocus, the larger your dot size is, and you could end up getting a little bit too blurry of a logo or a graphic or text. You kind of want to watch it with the defocusing, but this technique does wonders with getting that stubborn wood to engrave nice and dark the way you want it to. Another trick that you can use, and I don't use this one very often, but I have used it when engraving bamboo, which is notoriously hard to get a consistent dark engraving on without using any kind of backfilling technique or borax or something like that. So when it comes to really stubborn woods like bamboo, you can use the defocusing trick, but you can also create another file which is just scoring the edges of the engraving. So it's another layer file that you can put on top of that that's just the trace outlines of whatever you're engraving. Just make sure that you use a really high speed and just enough power to char the edges. What the combination of that does is you've got the defocusing trick, which already made it darker to begin with, but then you go ahead and you create this score line around every edge of the engraving, which actually adds even more contrast to the engraving. So those are 2 tips that you can use right now to get darker engravings on stubborn woods that just don't want to engrave dark. Pro tip number 8, dealing with cleaning up soot on wood or burnt marks on the underside of the wood. It's definitely something that you're going to run into, and it's definitely something you can avoid, and it's pretty easy to clean up if you know how to do it. A couple of things that we already talked about earlier was using too much air assist when you're doing engraving can create additional soot around the edges of your engraving that you're going to have to clean up later. If that is the case and you have no control over your air flow or the amount of air coming out, depending on what laser you have, there's a couple of different ways that you can clean up wood that has soot all around the engraving or char marks. If you have raw wood that hasn't been finished yet, of course you can use light sanding to get rid of that, because you know you're going to be able to put a treatment on it later. If it's something where you cannot sand it and you still have to get rid of some of that soot and that char, you can use rubbing alcohol. You can also use another chemical that I like to use called methanol, and I'll list links to all these things below in the description. With methanol, I found that it does a really good job removing really stubborn soot and tar and other kind of leftover char marks around the engraving or around the cut lines. Keep in mind, when using methanol, you want to definitely have gloves on, possibly even a respirator. And if that's uncomfortable for you, you can just use rubbing alcohol. Another type of char is the type of charring that you get around your laser cut lines when you're laser cutting wood. It can either be underneath the wood because the laser shot through the wood, hit the honeycomb table, and then flashed back on the underside of the wood, creating undesirable flashback burn marks on the underside of the wood, or it could be happening on the top side of the wood. A couple of ways to avoid those flashback marks on the underside of the wood is to mask the back of your sheet wood. Masking the back of the wood, especially if you're doing a lot of laser cutting ornaments and laser cut files, can be a great way to avoid any of those flash marks on the back side of your wood. And you can mask off the front if that's the case to make your cuts cleaner. I'll list links in the description below to the masks that I like to use. One thing to keep in mind, if you're masking the top of the wood and you're doing engraving, you need to consider the amount of weeding that you're going to have to do afterwards on that engraving part. It may not be a big deal if you're just doing cuts, but if it's an ornament where you've got the cut part and then you've got an engraving on the ornament as well, you're going to have to weed out all the different parts of that mask. So as we always talk about, time is money. You need to weigh whether it's worth it to you to have a clean ornament right off the bat, or if you just want to do the engraving and use one of the other cleaning techniques that we talked about just a second ago for the surface of your final file. All right, let's talk about number 9, making sure that all your parts are connected when you're laser cutting one-piece designs. Now, I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but in reality, some of these multi-layer complex laser cut signs that are all supposed to be one piece, or each layer is supposed to be one piece, may have parts that are floating in space that you'll need to creatively connect to the main design. Now you can use tools like Lightburn. I like to use Adobe Illustrator, and it's actually kind of like a fun puzzle that you get to figure out when you're doing these one-piece laser cut files, because you have to kind of move things around without making them look weird and smashed together, and just kind of get creative with it. And what you don't want to do is rush through making these type of one-piece laser cut designs, running over to the laser, cutting out your design, just to find out that certain parts of your letter dropped out that weren't supposed to, certain parts of the sky in your design or the moon or whatever is a loose part and wasn't connected to the main part of the design, because you're just wasting material at that point. So take the time to learn this skill of getting creative to join all of your elements together so you get nice, clean, amazing one-cut laser cut designs. So here's my pro tip number 10 and my final tip for this video, and that is you need to understand what a kerf is and why it matters to your laser cutting files. So if you're planning to laser cut some interlocking parts with your laser cutter, say you want to build some cool gift boxes or make some puzzles or dollhouse furniture or interlocking jewelry, you need to understand what your laser's kerf is and how it dramatically affects how those pieces will interlock. Okay, so your kerf is the amount of material that's removed from the wood on either side of your laser cutting line. So as your laser cuts the wood, it's removing a small amount of material from the wood on either side of the laser beam. That is what your kerf is. And it's really easy to measure what your kerf is. You can just cut yourself perfect 1 inch by 1 inch square and then take a measurement of what you cut using a digital caliper or your favorite measuring tool of choice. And the discrepancy is what your kerf is. Now you know what your kerf is for your laser, and now you can start to make adjustments for it in your laser cutting files. One of the most basic ways to make adjustments for your kerf is to offset inward. So let's say if your kerf measured to be 0.1 millimeters, you want to offset inward on your laser cutting lines by half of whatever your kerf is. So your offset inward would be 0.05 millimeters. That is a good starting point for adjusting for kerf. It sounds pretty basic, but it actually can be a little bit more complicated and more involved than the way I'm explaining it here. But what I wanted to get across to you is that if you are going to be doing interlocking laser cut parts, puzzles, inlays on wood with other pieces of wood, it's really important that you understand what the kerf is for your laser, and also how different woods can have different kerfs depending on the thickness of the wood, what type of wood it is. I'll list some links of some videos I think are really cool on YouTube about explaining in detail about kerf, how to adjust for it. One of them is using light burn and a couple other as well. So you have some resources and you can educate yourself on adjusting for kerf so you can have great, nice and tight interlocking pieces on all your laser cutting projects. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of Laser Engraving 911. Hey, I hope you got some value out of my top 10 pro tips for laser engraving and laser cutting wood. If you did get value from this video, make sure you smash that like button, leave a comment on your favorite pro tip. And once again, I've listed lots of resources in the description of the video to help you out in your new laser engraving business or your existing laser engraving business. So with that said, until next time, I'll see you around on Laser Engraving 911.